Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 1. My name is Professor Marlowe, and I'm happy to have the opportunity to work with you all this semester. In this course, you will be learning skills that will help you become more effective at your interpersonal communication, more competent with professional communication, and more at ease with your public speech presentation skills. So let's get started. This chapter will define communication, explain different elements of communication, and look at different communication models that help represent communication taking place. And we will also be looking at the core principles of communication. In addition, this chapter will help us analyze the ways in which digital media are transforming communication in some ways that are positive and some ways that contribute challenges. We will also look at the benefits of communicating effectively. And finally, we will help to learn how to apply guidelines that you can use for improving your overall communication effectiveness. Let's begin by defining a type of social capital that is very important in the modern professional environment. Social connections and networks that we are able to develop through communication will help us to advance our careers and to become competent in our chosen professions. Research has shown that people who are able to ascend professional and personal ladders in terms of corporate or organizational success tend to have good communication skills. Also, one of the most sought after skill sets that new employers are seeking when they look for new employees is good communication skills and effective communication skills. So obviously, being able to be a competent communicator will benefit us both in our professional lives, but also in our personal relationships. So let's define what communication actually is. Communication is defined as the deliberate or accidental transfer of meaning. Now, why do we have to distinguish between deliberate or accidental transferring of meaning? This is because sometimes we might send messages to people that are unintentional, and we may be perceived in a certain way that was not a deliberate intent on our part to communicate that, but it was accidental. So for example, let's say that you're walking down a busy hallway and you're on your way to class. Let's say that you see somebody in the hallway that you've known in different classes, and you wave at them. You put your arm up and say, "Hey, how's it going?" Now this person immediately turns the other direction and walks away quickly, all right? Now, we could assume that that person intentionally snubbed us or didn't want to communicate with us, but we might also know that people are on their way to class and they're very busy. And so it's entirely possible that in this situation, the person who turned and walked away may have actually just been very busy and didn't even see you because there were so many other people, and of course they were distracted. So for these reasons, we want to delineate or distinguish between the deliberate or accidental transfer of meaning. So intrapersonal communication deals with communication that we have with ourselves. So you may be asking, well, how much do we actually communicate with ourselves? Well, surprisingly, on a day-to-day basis, most of the communication that we interact with takes place with ourselves. So for example, what are some of the first thoughts that you have when you get out of bed in the morning? Do you have thoughts that are positive or life-giving? Do you have good thoughts about yourself and about the kind of day you're going to have? Or do you have thoughts that are negative about your day? Do you feel dread, or do you feel like you don't want to go to your job or go to school? What kinds of thoughts do you have about the people in your life and about the relationships that you have with people? What are the narratives that you tell yourself about the way that you interact with other people, or the kinds of relationships you have with people and the way that they treat you? How do you make sense of the various events that take place in your life? Do you have a positive attitude that's upbeat and that looks for the positive in every situation? Or do you tend to be somebody that's a little more negative or maybe pessimistic? Do you go through your day thinking good thoughts about yourself and the world around you? Or do you think with thoughts that are more negative? Now, the reality is that most of us tend to do both positive and negative thoughts, right? So the trick is really to become more conscious and more aware of the kind of thoughts and messages that you send yourself. because the communication that we have with ourselves is extremely important in terms of shaping our attitudes, shaping the way that we are perceived by other people, and also shaping our communication effectiveness with other people as well. Now let's switch gears a little bit and let's look at interpersonal communication. Interpersonal communication takes place between two people, usually who have a relationship that has been around or been established for a period of time. Okay? Interpersonal communication is something that takes place between you and your good friends, or perhaps you and your parents, or you and your siblings. Okay? So interpersonal communication assumes that there is a past that people share, a present that they share, and a future to the relationship. Now let's also distinguish between group communication and the other types of communication that we've talked about. Now, group communication takes place when we have interactions with a limited number of people. Usually this includes 3 to 5, perhaps 8 to 10 max. And these types of group interactions take place most often when we're talking with classmates or in a classroom situation. We might also have group communication playing out when we work in organizations. We might also have group communication playing out if we belong to different community organizations or things like that. And so the various types of interactions and conversations that we have will change depending on whether we are communicating with ourselves, communicating with someone on an interpersonal level, or communicating in a more public or group communication level. So let's continue looking at the different types of communication that we might find ourselves in on a day-to-day basis. Now, in comparison to group communication, which usually involves between 2 and up to 8 or 10 people, public communication is communication interactions that are designed to inform people, persuade, or entertain them. So for example, if you find yourself in a classroom environment where there's a teacher or a professor and there are 20 or 30 students, we can decide that that is public communication because there are several people that are in the audience, and the lead position of the professor is to inform and persuade the students on various topics. We can also look at mass communication. Mass communication involves the transmission of messages that are processed by various types of media gatekeepers prior to being diffused to a large audience. Mass communication takes place in television, in film, in radio, on the internet, in the newspaper, and various other types of mass-mediated environments. Now, mass communication is something that has been radically shifting in the last 20 or 30 years because with the advent of the internet, anybody basically can go on the web and disseminate a message to thousands or even millions of people. So we find that the rules that used to govern mass communication have changed in many cases, especially with these sort of individual and private media access channels like YouTube, Twitter, or various other types of more mass public communication modes. But in terms of television, newspaper, film, and radio, right, oftentimes these are still mass-mediated messages that are handled and screened and decided based on the media gatekeepers, which are ultimately the people that are choosing which programs they're going to air, how they're going to edit the programs, what kind of content will be covered and what content will not be covered, and various things like that. We can also use online or machine-assisted communication to build relationships with people who have internet. So we might think about these various types of video games that you can play now that are mediated through a computer, right? And you might actually build relationships with people that you never met before that live in different states or countries even, right? So we can look at the various ways that the web, online, or machine-assisted communication allows us to build relationships with people in other places that in a more traditional communication environment, we might not have had the opportunity to get to know. So as you can see from these last two slides, there are several different types of communication environments that we may find ourselves in on a day-to-day basis. The different types of norms and rules that govern the way that we should communicate effectively oftentimes will change depending on the environment that we find ourselves in. So it's very good to be aware of these environments, and we're going to get into some of these topics in a lot more detail as we go through this chapter and the course. So for this, we're just going to stop here and we will address these issues in more detail later on. Your textbook provides us with several communication models that allow us to visualize the process of communication playing out between senders and receivers. So when we look at essentials of communication, these involve the various components that are present during every communication event. So every communication event must involve people. And these people are either the senders of the message, and these are the people who are developing or formulating, encoding or writing, texting, speaking, right? And transmitting a message. Also, on the receiving end, we have the people who are listening, reading, right? Hearing and decoding and making sense of the message. It's very important for us to think about the sender and the receiver in terms of their participation in communication, because a lot of times people who are sending and receiving messages are also dealing with various types of distractions or noise or different types of perceptual issues. The way that they see the world can be shaping the way that we might send a message or the way that we might interpret a message. And we're going to talk about these issues in more detail as we move on. But suffice to say that it's always important for us to think about the people involved and the environment when we are looking at communication. Every communication interaction has a message. Even when we send messages to people without using words, we can still use a lot of nonverbal cues to send a message to another person. So we can use our face or our eyes, we can use our body posture, we can send messages based on how we carry ourselves, we can send messages based on how we dress or the way that we decorate ourselves. So messages have a verbal and a nonverbal component, and every communication interaction has a message. The channel involves the mode or the media that we use to send the message. So we might communicate in person with people, or we might be communicating through a cell phone or a computer, or maybe we have Skype or FaceTime, or maybe we're communicating in a public forum like on YouTube or Twitter or Facebook. So all of these various channels are important to be aware of because the norms and the communication appropriateness that governs these various scenarios may differ quite dramatically depending on what the situation is and who you're interacting with. Also, we want to be aware of noise, and noise is anything that can interfere or distort our ability to send and receive messages. We might have noise that's internal. So internal noise could look like some psychological distraction, like maybe you're thinking about something that you experienced yesterday that was upsetting for you, and it's detracting from your ability to really listen effectively in your class today. You might also have external noise. External noise might take the form of hearing the air conditioning vent kicking on really loudly when you're in class, and maybe that's distracting. Or maybe the person next to you is tapping their pencil constantly, and that's distracting you from listening to the message. I'm sure we can all think of examples where internal or external noise has detracted from our ability to really communicate effectively. And so we really want to be aware of the ways that these various communication issues shape our ability to have effective interactions with people. Let's look at the way that context or setting can influence feedback that we may get when we're communicating with other people. Now, when we find ourselves in a communication environment, in many cases, we will receive some kind of positive feedback. Positive feedback is feedback that is designed to enhance or continue to promote a certain type of behavior. So, for example, if you find yourself talking with a professor after class and you're discussing an issue with them that you're confused about, and your professor is nodding and saying things like, yes, I understand. That is a good example of positive feedback. In nodding their heads, the professor is saying that they understand what you're saying, right? And in using different types of verbal cues, such as or yes, I understand, they are encouraging you to continue talking and that they are validating what you're saying about the various issue. However, sometimes we may find ourselves in interactions where we experience negative feedback. Negative feedback takes place when a communication behavior extinguishes or diminishes certain behavior that is in progress. So, for example, let's say that you are in a conversation with a professor and you are attempting to share your confusion about a course issue. Rather than nodding at you and making cues that are verbal that show that they understand, perhaps your professor does things like takes a few steps back, scrunches up their nose and kind of makes their eyes small and looks at you as if there's something wrong with you for being confused. This would be a good example of negative feedback. And I don't know about you, but if I was having a conversation with a professor and this happened, I would probably feel that I did not want to continue talking or sharing my confusion with them. Hopefully, none of you have to experience having a professor with this kind of a tendency, but it is good to be able to distinguish between positive and negative feedback because we want to be able to, number one, identify when we are receiving positive or negative feedback from another person, and number two, we want to be able to use positive and negative feedback effectively. In addition, we may go through things that relate to having internal feedback, which is basically going back to the intrapersonal process where we give ourselves feedback or internal thoughts about what we're saying. So if you can use a situation like the one that we just discussed, perhaps when you are talking to your professor, you start to notice that you are using a lot of hedge words, which are words like like, right? And you start to become aware of the fact that maybe you're coming across as not as confident as you would like to be perceived. So if you say to yourself as you're talking, wow, I really want to speak more clearly to my professor so that I can get my point across in a more effective way. That would be an example of internal feedback that you might give yourself. However, external feedback deals with the responses that we get from other people. So again, external feedback would involve your professor talking to you about what you're saying, and perhaps they are giving you the feedback that says something like, I'm really happy that you came in to talk with me today about the areas that you're confused about. I think that once we discuss these topics in more detail, that you'll have a much more clear idea of what the expectations are in the class. And I'm glad that we were able to have this conversation. That's a good example of external feedback that you might receive from another person. Now, these issues, all of these different items on the model or that you're going to be looking at here in a second, are important in order for us to be able to have effective communication with other people. So let's look at some of these models in more detail. The two models of communication that we're going to be looking at today are Gamble and Gamble's model of communication and Dance's communication helix. Each of these models provides important information to help us better understand the process of communication, and so let's get into these in more detail. Looking at Gamble and Gamble's model of communication, you can see that the context and the environment is the label at the top, okay? This includes what type of a communication context we find ourselves in. Now, going back to the different types of communication, we can distinguish between interpersonal or relational communication. We can also look at group communication. We might also be able to look at public communication, right? And these are different types of contexts. Now, what this implies is that every different context has a different way to communicate that is considered to be appropriate. So, for example, when you're communicating with a friend of yours on an interpersonal level, you don't need to worry about raising your hand to say what you're thinking because there's an assumption there's going to be an even exchange of information back and forth in real time between you and your friend, right? However, let's compare that to being at a meeting at work with maybe 5 to 10 people. Now, in that kind of a situation, you definitely would not want to just start talking whenever you think of something because you want to make sure that you're not interrupting people and that you are communicating when it's an appropriate time for you to communicate. For example, you wouldn't want to start talking over your boss or over your manager because that would be considered disrespectful and inappropriate. Similarly, we can look at the context of the public setting, such as a classroom or maybe an auditorium or something like that. So when you're in a classroom environment, that's even more important in terms of modifying your communication so that it's appropriate, because you have people who are trying to listen to a speaker who is up in front of the room. And when there is noise happening in the classroom with people talking or making noise or laughing, then it's more difficult for everybody in the classroom to hear the public speaker or the teacher. Similarly, if we are talking during someone's presentation or during a teacher's presentation, that can also be perceived as disrespectful, because it is assumed if somebody is giving a public speech that the people who are sitting in the audience have agreed to be there and that they are agreeing to adapt their communication so that it is appropriate. So we can also look at this model and we can look at the difference between person A and person B. Now, if you look at person A on the left, you see that person A has their own field of experience, okay? And person B has their own field of experience. Now, the field of experience that people may have deals with the different types of experiences that they've had that have led up to this moment. So we can look at things like the culture that a person is from and the way that that culture taught them to communicate effectively. In some cultures, making consistent eye contact is considered a sign of respect. In other cultures, making consistent eye contact is seen as disrespectful or confrontational. So those are different types of experiences people can bring to the table. We also might have the different types of education that people have, or different types of work experience that people have. This can shape the way that people hear things, and perceive people, right? This can also shape the way that people may speak or communicate, because people who are more educated may use vocabulary or words or phrases that are more university or business or academic based than people who have not gone for formal education. We can also look at different things like the biases that we might have. So when we look at biases, biases involve any kinds of positive or negative assumptions that we may make about people or situations based on our raising and our upbringing or based on our experiences. And so the person who is sending the message initially, right, that would be person A, all of these different types of experiences go into how that person may identify a message that they want to send, how they may construct or encode that message, and how they may send the message, okay? And also their expectations of the way that the message will be interpreted. Now we can also look at person B's field of experience. Person B obviously has their own culture that they came from. They might be of a different age group or a different gender. They might have different types of communication experiences that have shaped them in a positive or a negative way that may influence how they perceive other people, right? So we can never assume that other people are coming from the same place that we are when we are communicating, because the reality is that most people have a very unique framework and a unique base of experience that they take into every communication interaction. And what this means is that we may have misunderstandings that take place, and people may not even realize that there's a misunderstanding because they may make assumptions that other people understand things the way they do, or have the same biases they do, or things like that. Now, this model also allows us to look at the message or the channel. You can see that in the red line. The message is, of course, what's being said or what's being encoded, and channel deals with the way in which we're conveying the message. So the different channels might include talking in person, talking on the phone, texting a message, communicating through a computer or through Skype or FaceTime, right? There's lots of different ways that we can send messages and lots of different channels that we might use. And then, of course, if you look at the blue arrow, what this suggests or what this identifies is that we will always be getting feedback from people in a communication interaction. So the feedback may be positive, or the feedback may be neutral, or the feedback might be negative. And we did talk about this on a previous slide. And then when we look at the middle of this diagram, there's that orange part with the green arrow or the green bolt through it, okay? And the orange part implies that there is a shared field of experience that person A and person B are able to create together through effective communication, okay? And of course, the green bolts imply internal and external noise that may be shaping how effective we are in terms of our ability to hear what someone is saying and in terms of our ability to give feedback and share our own experience. So Gamble and Gamble provide a very useful model to help us understand all the different factors that can play into whether we are able to have effective communication or whether we face various challenges which will inhibit effective communication. Let's look at figure 1-2 in your textbook. And figure 1-2 allows us to look at the model promoted by Dance. And Dance came up with a communication helix. And what this is this is a model that allows us to view the communication process in a more abstract or creative way. Dance's spiral represents the way that communication can progress in a person from birth until the present moment. The model reinforces the fact that each person's behavior in the moment is affected by all of their past experiences and that their present behavior will also shape future interactions. This model also helps us to identify the fact that communication does not have any kind of clearly marked beginning and end and no ending in mind. Now, this is clearly a very abstract model, but I think that we can think of it in terms of the impact that history has on who we are today and how we progress in the future. And as we know, our past experiences shape the way that we communicate now, and the way that we're communicating and relating to people today will shape the way that we interact in the future. Figure 1-3 of Dance's model also allows us to look at a visual display of communication playing out between people. So on the left in red, you have one person, and on the right in blue, you have another person. And as you see, as the lines start to intertwine and move down in the model, we see that there is a constant sending and receiving of messages between two people. Now, for some people, you may only send a message or two to them in your whole lifetime, right? So when you go to the grocery store, for example, you're only going to have a very routine transactional interaction. There's not a lot of history there. There won't likely be much future. However, in many cases, we may have ongoing interactions with people, right? Or we may have interactions with people for a limited amount of time, let's say for a few weeks or for a semester, as in the case when we're in a class with different students. And then sometimes you might see that the interactions phase out at the bottom of this model, and we don't actually interact with these people anymore. So figure 1-3 allows us to look at communication in this way. Now, figure 1-4 is also Dance's model, and we can see how in some relationships, people may have a separate and distinct past, and they may communicate and work and live and relate together for a certain amount of time. And then in some cases, relationships may end or dissolve, and people may end up going their own way. But I think what this model is very good at pointing out is the fact that there is a shared history that all of us have with people who we have had relationships with in the past, and the people who we are relating with now will shape who we become and how we relate to other people in the future. And so this model is useful in thinking about communication in this way and in helping to identify the way in which history can shape communication in the present and in the future. So let's look at some different aspects to communication that we want to be aware of as we move forward in the course. First of all, communication is dynamic. What this means is that it is constantly ongoing. All humans who interact in a human world are going to be dealing with relationships that they have had in the past, which shape who they are now, and which will shape how they communicate. And in turn, that will shape their future in terms of relationships they may or may not have, how they relate to those relationships, and what they bring into the relationships. So it's important to be aware of that. Another thing is that communication is unrepeatable and irreversible. Okay, so every interaction that we have is going to be unique in terms of the things that we bring to the table, how effective it is, whether it felt good or didn't feel good, right? And it's really true what they say about the idea of communication being irreversible. Sometimes we wish that we could just go back and undo something, right? Or get another shot to have a conversation and do a better job so that we were more loving or more kind or more understanding, right? But as we know, communication is not reversible. We are not able to go back and change things, which is why we want to work now to make good decisions about the way that we relate to ourselves and to other people. Communication has no opposite. What this relates to is the fact that although it's true that communication is purposeful, right? Because we are desiring to share a message with people, the reality is that sometimes communication might be unintentional as well. So even if we are choosing not to say anything, that is still a type of a communication message, right? So according to your book, we can never voluntarily stop behaving because behavior has no opposite, right? Even a lack of behavior is a type of behavior. So even if you think that you're just not going to communicate anymore with someone or you're going to just stop responding to them, although there is no actual verbal communication taking place, there is a very clear communication taking place when we decide to stop responding to people, right? And that communication is something that basically says, I don't want to interact with you, I don't value this interaction anymore, or this is something I'm not interested in. Communication is affected by culture. Culture has a huge influence in terms of how people perceive the world, how they perceive communication, and what they perceive to be important and effective communication strategies. So this is something that's very good to take into our interactions with other people, because a lot of times we might have miscommunications that are simply based on cultural background. Likewise, people might make assumptions about us that are based on culture, whether it's an assumption that we are similar to them because we look like we share the same culture as them, or an assumption that we're a lot different than them because of our cultural background. So culture is always something to be interested in and sensitive about. Now, there's a lot of literature that looks at the impact of culture in terms of how people communicate in modern organizations. And lots of managers and corporate leaders are integrating cultural training into their regular training protocol for employees because of the fact that they know how important it is to be a good communicator cross-culturally. So it's always a good idea to try to do research about different types of communication strategies and communication values and how they shape the way that different cultures might communicate, because this will equip you with the ability to be more competent when you find yourself interacting with people who are different than you. Communication is also influenced by ethics. Ethics shape the way that we perceive the world in terms of what we think is considered to be honest, acceptable, or appropriate behavior, okay? So in general, we all know that we are expected to tell the truth and that we are expected to communicate in a way that is not hurtful or that doesn't demean people or make them feel bad, right? So communication is influenced by ethics, and it's also something that we want to think about before we send a message to someone. Is this an ethical way to share this information, or is it ethical at all that I'm even telling this person this information? Communication is competence-based. Now, every person has certain types of strengths and challenges, right? So the challenge that we face in being good communicators is trying to figure out how it is that we can communicate competently even if we're dealing with people who have different skill sets. So, for example, sometimes I find myself communicating with students who are not English as first language students. So perhaps they're speaking English as a second language. Now, what that means for me is that I need to modify my communication so that I can be more effective with certain types of people when I talk to them, right? Sometimes what this means is I might want to speak in a way that's more clear. I may want to paraphrase or ask, does that make sense? Or do you understand what I'm saying? I may want to slow down my speech because it would be easier for someone to understand me. And these are all ways that we can accommodate different types of competence that people might bring into a situation. So all of these issues will shape how effective we are at communication, and you can start to think where you are in terms of your understanding and your competence on these various issues. It's also important to discuss the fact that media and technology are radically transforming communication in the modern environment. Technology is basically the use of electronic or digital means in order to fulfill the various things that we need to accomplish on a day-to-day basis, right? So we might use technology to get information. We might use technology to communicate with people. We might use technology to plan our day. Perhaps we have an online calendar, right? But we always want to be careful about using technology so much that it overwhelms or dominates our ability to have effective communication interactions. I'd like you to think about a hypothetical scenario where you go to your favorite restaurant and you sit down there with your friend to have a meal, and your friend pulls out their cell phone and starts scrolling through the various types of messages that people may have been sending them, or they check their Facebook account to see how many likes they got on that picture they posted of their breakfast that morning, right? I want you to put yourself on the receiving end of how it feels to be sitting across from someone trying to have a meal where you can connect when one of you or even both of you is sitting there scrolling through your phone the whole time. How does the distraction of having your cell phone in your hand influence your ability to really connect with people on an interpersonal level? How does having your cell phone shape the conversations that you have or how you talk about various things? How does having that cell phone there influence your ability to really connect emotionally with people? Is the cell phone a type of a distraction that we have which allows us to not have to get so close to people or to talk about issues that are that important? How does having your cell phone there influence your ability to really decode the nonverbal cues that you have playing out in front of you? So if I'm staring at my phone, am I really able to see what is going on the face of the other person? Or am I distracted with other things? Let's say you get your food and you start to eat, your friend and you put your cell phones down and you start to eat your delicious meal, right? And you start thinking about this. I wonder how cell phones are shaping communication. And you turn and you look around the restaurant and you see a family sitting across from you in a booth. And in the family, you see mom and dad, and you see a couple of kids under the age of 8 or 10, okay? And in the booth, instead of having a family conversation where mom and dad are talking to the kids about school or about, what's going on that weekend with soccer, you notice that both the parents are scrolling through their phones. You notice that they're not talking to each other. You notice they're not talking to their kids. You notice they're not even looking at each other, right? Except to look at the menu so they can place their order. And then you look at the kids that are sitting there, and the kids are trying to get the attention of their mom, tapping them on the shoulder, saying, "Mom, Mom," and mom is not able to pay attention to them, right? Because she's busy with her phone, checking messages, looking at Facebook, right? Or perhaps you see dad sitting there wanting to connect with mom, and mom has her cell phone out, and dad is sitting there looking at her, feeling sad because mom is too distracted to have a conversation at dinner. These are all scenarios that I have personally seen when I go out to eat. And I've seen it happen with couples, I've seen it happen with friends, I've seen it even happen with families where parents are sitting there with their children and they're ignoring their kids so that they can scroll through their phone. So these are things that we really want to become conscious of, definitely aware of, and we want to be careful that we don't allow technology to impede our ability to have good communication and to have effective relationships as well. So let's go back to where we started at the beginning of this chapter, looking at why we communicate. The first reason that we communicate is to gain a self-understanding and to gain understanding into other people. We need to have conversations with people in order to understand where they're from, what's important to them, what kinds of issues that we plan to talk about together, or what kinds of plans we want to make for our interactions in our lives together, right? We also need to communicate in order to understand why people believe what they think or believe, why they communicate the way that they communicate, what they're feeling and thinking, okay? So communication is extremely important, and gaining that self-understanding and insight into other people is something that can only happen through communication. We also must communicate in order to form meaningful relationships. It's very important to think about the relationships we have in our life right now and how effectively we are currently using communication. Maybe some of us would like to improve our ability to communicate with our parents or with our children or with our spouses or our friends. Maybe we would want to improve our ability to give public speeches. There are lots of ways that we can form meaningful relationships through communication, and psychologists tell us that when we are cut off from human contact, people become disoriented, maladjusted, and that mental, emotional, and physical health itself actually suffer. So the need for inclusion is extremely important in terms of social contact, having consistent, ongoing relationships with people that are supportive, that allow us to become full people and to feel that we have the kinds of relationships that are meeting our needs. However, we also need to feel that we have control. We need to feel that we are capable of shaping our lives and that we can decide that we want to do something and be responsible about making it happen, right? We need to be able to feel that we have agency or competence, and studying communication helps us to do that. Also, we need to have affection. Human beings need to feel loved. They need to express love to other people, right? In order to feel like we are achieving full personhood, we need to have good relationships that are supportive, right? And in order to have good mental, physical, and emotional health, we need to have effective relationships. And this is all mediated through good communication. We also may communicate to influence other people. So you may find yourself in a situation where you want to persuade someone to think the way you think, or to like what you do, or to like what you say, right? We may want to influence other people to give us a job, or to let us have that account that we've been trying to work to get for so many years at that corporation we've been working at. So influencing other people is another good reason to learn to be an effective communicator. And finally, being effective in our career development also includes cultivating good communication skills. We want to have good communication skills in terms of our interpersonal ability, in terms of our small group communication, and also in terms of public communication, or communication where we have to give public speeches or other types of situations like that. You may also find yourself having to run meetings at a corporation, or having to go out and get clients, or having to go out and present things to certain organizations or nonprofit community organizations for funding or for collaboration or things like that. These are all different types of situations we may find ourselves in where effective communication will help us with our career development. So, to sum up this chapter, we have discussed various things related to effective communication. So in conclusion, in order to practice effective communication, we all want to become actively involved in studying communication and in learning how to monitor our own communication so that we can become more effective in our day-to-day relationships with other people. Likewise, we also want to set and track personal goals that we may have for our communication competence. Now, for some of us, we know how to communicate very well in terms of interpersonal one-on-one communication with our friends or family members. However, a lot of us may feel kind of nervous or unsure about doing public speaking, for example. This course is going to allow you to have several opportunities to develop your public speaking skills so that you can learn to be more comfortable and competent in terms of public speaking. So this would be a type of a goal situation where you could set a goal to learn to be a better public speaker and track your goal, both in terms of how you feel about your ability to be competent, but also in terms of measurable goals. So throughout this course, I will be providing feedback on your speeches so that you can learn to be a more effective communicator. And this will also allow you to track your goals for that as well. The last thing that we want to do is we want to have faith in ourselves. Believe in yourself. There is no person in the world that is perfect at communication or at anything. Everybody brings their own strengths and their own limitations into our interactions with others. So we want to set realistic goals. We want to get good at identifying when we meet our goals and maybe when we could do better. And we want to become accountable for our communication behaviors, because when we are accountable, then we can decide that we want to change something and then we can change it, right? If we don't take responsibility for our behaviors, then that doesn't allow us to be empowered to be proactive individuals who are actively choosing how they want to communicate and how they want to relate to people. So just remember that no matter where you're starting out in terms of your communication competence today, you can set goals for yourself in terms of your intrapersonal communications, so the types of thoughts and ideas and messages you give yourself. Maybe you want to be more positive. You can set a goal for that and you can make it happen, and that will influence your life in huge ways. It'll influence your attitude. It'll influence how you feel about yourself and other people. It'll influence your confidence. We can also set goals in terms of our interpersonal relationships. Maybe we want to get more effective at learning how to identify and manage our emotions. When we know how to identify and manage our emotions, we're able to have better relationships with people. So that could be another type of a goal. Maybe you want to learn more professional communication for your job situation, or maybe you want to learn to be more effective with public speaking. These are all different types of goals that you can set and you can put forth and you can work towards. And we don't expect perfection, and you shouldn't expect perfection from yourself in any of these situations, but you should try your best. And when you find a situation when you feel like you could improve, then identify what it is that happened and how you would like to behave in the future, and you can put that plan into play for the next time you find yourself in a similar situation. I hope that this chapter has been useful for you. I know that these principles are very useful in my own life and in the life of people I know and love. I'm excited to discuss these issues with you in more detail as we get into the course. So thank you for your attention, and I will talk to you all in Chapter 2.